Okay, thank you, Ruth, for being part of this interview for Dis-ease. Ite Panik Agusuin, which is a Swampy Cree term, which is very much located in kind of my territory, but because I'm co-curating with Timothy, I thought it was pertinent to include that. And it's a Cree word that means a disease that's spreading to many. And you've been doing work around this for a very long time, touching on, diseases that have been brought over through colonization and how it's affected our Indigenous people here in Canada and the States and even globally. We were really lucky to receive a new acquisition called Surviving COVID-19, which is featured in the exhibition. And I just wanted to ask you, how does that piece relate to the trading series?
Well, I think the work that I'm interested in is disease and how it spreads, especially the trading series, because when all those diseases from the old world came to the new world, a lot of them were like children's diseases like measles, chickenpox, but the people that lived in the New World had never been exposed to those kind of diseases. So it was like epidemic after epidemic after epidemic. And we survived through those. We lost a lot of people, but we still survived. And thinking about COVID, when they started talking about pandemic, and I was worried because of the diseases that came with trade. And I thought, what's going to happen with this COVID-19? Is it going to decimate us again? Is because our housing is inferior and overcrowded, and then there's reserves that don't have clean water to wash your hands. So I started beating the series because I wanted to sort of look at that. And then as the pandemic continued, I was really amazed at how reserves really responded to it. Like on my reserve, Little Pine, you couldn't get on the reserve. They had roadblocks. They would ask you who you are, where you're going, and they'd check that out. Like my brother and sister-in-law and my niece and I, we went to the reserve to clean graves, and so we had to stop and tell them we were going to the graveyard and we weren't going to visit anyone, and give us an hour and a half and we'd be out. And so I really like that, the way they kind of shut down reserves. And they also kept people from going out. They also supplied food, and in the spring they went around and rototilled people so they could grow their own food, which I think is really, really good for our people to get back to gardening.
Yeah, food sovereignty is so important, and I certainly see such a real resurgence in that. And I think amongst other things, this pandemic has allowed those things to come back.
Yeah.
And even hunting and fishing. Kind of brings me to my other question. Okay. I was reading a really interesting article written by Bell Hooks, and it's in her Liberation Scenes Speak This Yearning, and she talks about the survival of Black people during slavery and how it was due to oppositional ways of thinking. And it was also how those ways of thinking were different from the structures of domination that ruled much of their lives during slavery. So it made me think about, our people, Indigenous people, and their survival of introduced diseases and pandemics, and how we look at things differently. You touched on some of that just now, but can you talk a little bit more about the trading series in general and that, those modes of oppositional ways of thinking?
What I wanted to do with that was kind of look at disease in a new way. And first of all, I love the microscopic images because they're so abstract. And when you think of abstraction, and especially Plains Indigenous women who used abstract designs, I was drawn to that. And then I was drawn to the bead because the depth of color of glass is just gorgeous, and then the shine from the glass. And so you have these microscopic images that are beaded, and they really draw you in because they're so beautiful. And then once you get drawn into them, then you realize that it's a disease, and then so there's that kind of, you step back or you repel a little bit from it, and so there's that tension between the work and the viewer. Also, when you think of the bead as an animate object, it's like in the Cree language, the bead is an animate object, and so you have inanimate and animate objects. And so an animate object is something that has a life to it. And so if you think about beads as being gorgeous things with a life to it, and then at the same time you're talking about disease that is sort of can bring death. It's really interesting.
I think my first impression of you, and I've heard this from other curators, other fans of your work, is that you're a really strong example of an Indigenous feminist, which is very much different from white feminism, that really disincluded people of color and Indigenous women. I see that throughout the span of your career, which is a long career. With the trading series, it also does touch on women's work and the importance of women's roles. Especially, I think about the fur trade just naturally because coming from Cumberland House and the importance of the fur trade in my area, and seeing beadwork growing up in Cumberland House. Have you found that, well, you probably have, that women aren't as represented in colonial narratives, like within history, but also even within contemporary art? Like, you don't see a lot of strong feminist narratives within Indigenous contemporary art. And I think and it's so raw, the work that you do. You often hear that, her work's so raw, but like, I think it connotes this real bluntness, this strength, that's very Indigenous,
Yeah.
Where does that come from? And like, why do you do it? And why is women's work important to you?
I was a young woman when the women's movement came, even before it was called feminism. I was like about 18 years old. And I think because I grew up in a house where my father worked and my mother stayed home, and she really subsumed herself and was a traditional housewife, like everything centered around my dad. And when he came home, there was tea and stuff. She would rush and do those things for him. And I think she was a very smart woman. And I kind of realized that her life was sort of squashed down, and I wanted a different life for myself. And so I started to kind of learn about the women's movement and what that was about. And a lot of it at that point was around birth control and control of your body and that kind of thing. And then as it gradually grew into different things where, equal pay, that kind of thing, as I watched the women's movement kind of morph into feminism, and then I sort of I agreed with a lot of the things that they were talking about. But I also knew that there's a big difference between, I think, Indigenous women than white women. I think, I don't want to say it in a mean way, but white women sort of represent capitalism and competition. And I think Indigenous women were our identity is more as a group. We sort of like to help each other along. I taught for many years in Indigenous art history and teaching studio classes. And every time I would find a student that really stood out for me, It was like I would just give them really good things so that they could achieve, because I really want to help young people get it and move into places where I couldn't go.
Yeah.
And that's you, Felicia.
Yes, I was one of your students.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so I think that's what's, when I think of feminism and Indigenous women, I think it is a way of uplifting each other. Yeah.